morning, everyone. Welcome to tonight's episode of Embracing the Moment. I'm Pastor Joe, discipleship pastor here at Genesis Church, and we're taking a brief pause from our current series to have kind of the standalone episode on a really, really important topic. And the topic that we're going to be covering tonight is the rise of LGBT self-identification. If you have seen last week, February 24th, Gallup released a new poll showing that LGBT self-identification rose to 5.6% of the U.S. population. So with me this evening, I'm really excited to have this conversation. With me this evening is Jim Ehrman. Jim is the Vice President of Advancement, as well as Instructor of Theology and Culture at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. So Jim, thanks so much for joining me in this conversation.
Thrilled to be here, Joe.
Really excited for it. Thank you. So before we jump into our conversation here, Jim, for those tuning in, I want to highlight in brief, and you can Google Gallup poll LGBT self-identification. You can find this on your own, but I just want to highlight a couple of important statistics from this as we kind of set the table for our conversation. So as I read through the article, what I saw was back in 2017, last time Gallup did this. And by the way, for those of you wondering, Gallup, what is this? Are we talking about horses? What are we talking about? No, we're not talking about horses. We're talking about Gallup Incorporated, which is an American analytics and advisory company known for conducting public opinion polls. So their goal, their aim, is to represent the opinions of a sample group that they survey, and then be able to correlate that across a given country, in this case, the United States, and in this case, the issue of LGBT self-identification. So last time they did their poll was in 2017, and what they had found was 4.5% of US adults identified with the lifestyles of L, G, B, or T, that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Now in 2020, or last year in 2020, they found 5.6% of US adults identify with one of those four lifestyles. They found, interestingly enough, 3.1% of US adults, so the whole population, identify as bisexual. So this was the leading of the four lifestyles that people identify with. And then if we zero in further to those who identify with the LGBT lifestyles, one of those lifestyles, we find that 54.6% of LGBT adults identify as bisexual. 24.5% identify as gay, 11.7% as lesbian, and 11.3% as transgender. When we break this down into male versus female, we find that 6.4% of US adult women identify as LGBT, and 4.9% of men identify as LGBT. Mm-hmm. And then one last breakdown that I thought was really important from this article, when we look at the generational breakdown, we find that millennials, that is ages 24 through 39, 9.1% identify as LGBT. And then when we go further down the line generationally, Generation Z, that is 18 through 23 years old, 15.9% identify as LGBT. So that's roughly nearly 1 in 6 out of every member of Gen Z identifies with one of these four particular lifestyles. So all that being said, setting the table for our conversation here, Jim, can you just briefly share with us what is your current vocational role, and kind of help us understand how is this topic especially relevant in your particular context?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. First of all, I'm coming to you from Lebanon, Pennsylvania. Even though I work at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, I jump back and forth. I just came back from a week in Seattle Sunday night. So just I live bi-coastally at the moment, and I really like it because it puts me in different contexts. Matter of fact, I spent 6 hours on this past Monday, working on an LGBTQ statement by our school in Seattle. So this is really live for me this week, right? And that was minus even these statistics coming out last week. So first of all, one of the reasons I care and why my role cares about this is because I just don't think that society has many safe places to hold conversations anymore, right? Not just we as Christians, but where can we go where it's not driven by algorithm stuff that we're reading because computer algorithms suggested what we should read on our devices. We're going to talk here in a bit about identifiers are driving the church in different directions, political identifiers. And so first of all, I care about this issue because, like you, Joe, I'm an educator. You're a pastor of discipleship. I'm an educator. I'm a teaching pastor at a church. I care about creating conversation points around complex issues because we need to know we've got to cut through the control issues, the emotional factors come in. So I'm thrilled for embracing the moment that you're taking the time to slow down and let's just all take a breath and examine a topic for what we do and do not know about it, not just driven by our personal influences in this. So I'm thrilled to be here and looking forward to diving into this one and think because I live a little bit in the Pacific Northwest and I live a little bit in the Bible Belt of the Northeast, I know a bit about the complexity of that conversation at the moment.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And I so appreciate that idea of having those safe places that seem to be so few and far between. Again, I love that, not just within the church, but in our particular culture.
Yeah.
So I also want to highlight for those tuning in. So not only is Jim a jet setter, but he's actually from York County.
That's right. I grew up in Dover, 4 miles north. I never traveled till I was 22 years old. I never traveled further than Ocean City, Maryland in my life. And now I can't seem to sit still. So York County is deeply in my world, right?
So shout out to those tuning in locally here this evening.
Good folk.
So all right, Jim, help us understand why should we pay attention to this Gallup poll? Why should we care about this particular issue?
Yeah, not just why should we, but why does this one grab us a little bit? Because I'll start off by reminding you that knowing which statistics when you hear them impact you is a self-teacher. Notice when things you read that grab your attention. For instance, we could be sitting here and talking about the fact that within our churches, for those of you who come from faith communities, 50% of the marriages within our churches claim that they have systemic struggles or issues within it. 60 to 70% of the people in our churches claim that they have at least occasional reference to pornography, right? We are recognized in the West as the most consumeristic culture. And within our churches, of those who tithe, they tithe only 2%. So we're one of the least generous mass cultures that exist right now, given our wealth. And so I'll remind you that statistics are interesting, even in those 4 I just ripped off. We as the church are just concerned citizens. We should be able to stop, drop, and roll on any of those, even if you're not a Christ follower, to sit and go, wow, why does the average person in North America give away less than 2% of their income, right? That alone is we're talking about. But there's something about this stat. Because it was a significant jump. That's what made headlines here. Whether or not you called it and what Joe was talking, to have a 1.4% jump in a matter of 3 years, particularly among the millennials who went from identifying 9.1% a few years ago to 1 in 6, 15.9% of millennials identify as LGBTQ. By the way, in cultural statistical issues, that's a huge jump. So why did this one capture our attention, particularly the church? If you've been following the church, it is a buzz on the internet last week with conversations about this Gallup poll. So, we almost have to begin there. Why did this one jump out at us, right?
Yeah, right. No, and that's a great observation. That really is. And it is. I mean, statistically speaking, this is a huge jump.
Yeah.
And to clarify on that last point with millennials, it was actually the Gen Zers, the 18 to 20.
Yeah, sorry, that's the one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, just to clarify on that. But even that in and of itself, I mean, when we're talking roughly 1 in 6 individuals between the ages of 18 and 23 identifying, we have to be paying attention to this. There's these tectonic shifts going on within our culture that in some ways have been a long time in the making. Yeah. And then in other ways, I think sometimes they can be quite surprising to us.
That's right. And I'd like to suggest to you that I was surprised the number wasn't higher. How's that?
There you go. Okay.
Yeah, because remember, the word here is identify, not practicing. It's one of the first things I want to point out because I work around the realm of statistics. to say that you identify as something is quite different than practicing. Gallup did not give us those statistics, probably because that wasn't what their study was about. That's not manipulating or some kind of fake news reality. I just think the fact that Gallup decided to ask, do you identify? And that's where I want to make sure we pause right now, because that's one of the critical issues that is at work here, is that we have so few ways to identify anymore in North American Western culture. Let me give you an example. It used to be in the West that you identified socioeconomically. Matter of fact, if you watch any of the great period pieces in England, Downton Abbey, The Crown, etc., it's pretty clear there that your birth name, your socioeconomic status, they were social identifiers, right? And then we in North America, we didn't go with so much your birth name or your caste system place. We went with education. But it's not popular now to wave around education. Do you back remember when the day when if your minister or if people of prominence in culture had degrees, letters behind their names, they had authority? Well, those days are over. Like education, matter of fact, guys like Joe and I spent half our time hiding our education so we don't look out of touch, right? So all of a sudden, education isn't an identifier anymore. Socioeconomic, workplace identifiers are being leveled. One of my degrees is in organizational leadership. Flat hierarchies are what's in right now in organizations. So all of a sudden, you don't have workplace advancement identifiers. Our sports culture is now what we call participant-based culture. Come on, my 6-year-old son was not good at soccer. He still got the trophy, and it said participation award on it. So you don't have the same kind of identifiers in sports even that we once had. And then you add to that the fact that the number one identifier right now in most of our faith community is political. I mean, just think about it. Even now, Joe and I were talking a little bit before the podcast kicked off, that we were surprised that these statistics didn't make more of a stir in the church last week, or at least in the faith community. And partly it's because politics is our identifier at the moment, not socioeconomic, not educational. However, I will tell you something. Among Gen Zs and among millennials, they are being trained that sexual identification is the first and primary way to understand yourself, right? Let me just repeat that, because that Gen X, baby boomers, greatest generation, that was not our identifiers. Ours were socioeconomic, educational, workplace identifiers. You have to understand that millennials and Gen Z start with themselves. And that they're not trying to be proud in that, but it's the great old, I think, therefore I am. I start at the most basic level, and I am most basically a sexual being, right? Now, you and I might sit and go, no, but just so you know, that is what people are wrestling with at this moment. For instance, my daughter came home. She graduated. She's at Temple University now, but she came home from high school about 2 or 3 years ago now. And she went to a kind of arts high school in Harrisburg, and a wonderful school, but no doubt progressive, right? And she goes, Dad, you don't understand. At my school, it's the LGBTQIA students that are the cool kids. They want to know whether or not I've considered their lifestyle. Now, just pause there for a second. So the peer pressure she was facing wasn't you have to be LGBTQIN. It was like, have you considered why you're not? So now that's a very interesting thing. So my daughter had to sit and think through like, well, why am I not LGBTQIA? Now, because that has become an identifier in culture now. Now, we can sit and complain and go, well, that shouldn't be. But friends, every culture has their identifiers, right? Do you think workplace identification was better than sexuality? Do you really think socioeconomic status was a better identifier than sexuality? Maybe, but I tell you this, what I have had to suggest to my daughter is, hey, I want you to know something. I don't mind if you think through that question, but I don't think 15 is when the sexuality identifier is when you should be wrestling through that. So I want to remind you that if you're in that young generation right now, sexual identity, more so than political, definitely more so than socioeconomic, is your only way to identify yourself right now. So let's not be freaked out that these stats have jumped. Because while young people are making up their minds, they will always lean toward preference for the marginal or the other, and they will identify with them. And that's the second thing to be reminded, right? They are going to lean toward, hey, until I make up my mind whether or not I'm LGBTQIN, rather than them losing a vote in this conversation, I'll identify with them, right? Now, please don't hear me. I'm not saying that these statistics are false. I'm just trying to tell you that they are taken among a generation that will identify with the other while they're making up with whether or not they fully agree with that other. And you add to that to the fact that sexual identifier is one of the lead ways to do it right now. And this becomes a complex picture. So I'd like to suggest to you that practicing LGBTQIA, I'm not sure if it's as high as these statistics, but it does show us something. Young people are looking for identifiers since so many of our cultural ones have been stripped away. So, and they certainly don't want to go to politics because, friends, quite honestly, we're ugly on that. They don't like what they see on that. So they're not swinging to political identification, hence the great rise in the number of independent registered voters. Because they just don't like the way that one's playing out. So, Joe, that was a lot, but I throw that out there. Just even why these numbers are important right now, they show us something about this quest for identity that's at work in culture at the moment.
Yeah. Well, no. And hey, no, that might have been a lot, but it's powerful. It's thought provoking. I mean, we could just close in prayer and say, all right, you just gave us weeks to ponder. So thanks for laying it down, man. I mean, this is really, it's helpful to think it through from so many different angles, so many different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And it's hard for even me. Okay. So I'm a millennial. I'm in my early 30s. Mm-hmm. And it's even hard for me to wrap my mind around that as a kid who grew up in rural Pennsylvania, went to public school. You could look back and say you started to see these shifts even when I was in school, but how quickly and rapidly they have picked up, because even sitting here listening to your daughter's experience, mm-hmm. and going, wow, I never had to wrestle through that. I never had anybody ask me that question. Mm-hmm. I don't know what that's like.
That's right. Yeah. And by the way, she wasn't even bothered by the question. You and I might sit, well, that's offensive to have someone from a group ask you why you haven't considered it. But just so you know, we do it all the time as Christians, right? We're like, well, why haven't you considered the claims of Christ? When really someone could look at us and go, well, why should I? Right. But all that to say, I don't think we should be surprised that the LGBTQIA community is looking at us now and going, hey, get past all of your hidden persuaders and things that are driving you. Have you ever considered the fact that you might be one of these things? So at one level, my daughter wasn't fazed by the question. And truthfully, I don't mind if she wrestles with that question one day. I just have to remind you, probably at 15, you don't have developed enough frontal lobe to make sexuality your lead identifier. It's much more better. What I had to substitute for my daughter was, hey, I didn't ask her, what do you want to be when you grow up? That's not a good question either, right? Because that puts emphasis on workplace. I said this. So, hey, rather than identify on that, let's look at the world's issues. Which one do you wish you could solve when you were older? So I changed the question to, what issue would you like to solve in the world when you're older? Because I wanted to give a 15-year-old something to identify with. Because if I leave her just to use sexuality as her identifier, the prefrontal lobe, much less all the messages that are out there and all the white noise in this conversation space, is more than a 15-year-old can process, right? So I like to even suggest that to us as the church in general. We get so focused on certain major cultural white noise voices, politics, etc., when really I would think that our Christ is asking us, hey, what problems do you want to solve in the world that I could empower you for? Versus, how do you want to sink down your identity and form subgroups and then make sure everyone else validates you? Because that's the move right now, right? Whether it's sexuality, political, whether that's economic, validate me. And I'm going to suggest to you the Christian message is slightly different. I have made you to go tackle world issues. Which one do you want to do? Identify with the mission I want to give you. And that gets exciting for me.
All right, so let's unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah.
So when I'm hearing that as a young pastor, I'm going, okay, Jim, how can we as God's people, how can churches in our country, how can we respond to this particular issue in love, in truth, and in grace?
Yeah, I always say this: if I was talking to someone who was thinking through whether or not they are or want to be LGBTQIA, excuse me, I would oftentimes ask, hey, simply, do you have any other self-identifiers outside of your sexuality?
Mhm.
Just like right now, I sit in my church sometimes and I look at some of the voices I'm hearing going, do you have any other identifiers outside of the Republican or the Democratic Party? Because
Mhm.
if you don't, that is a first question we need to ask ourselves. What do we use to identify who we are in the world?
Wow.
And so I sometimes say to those of you who might even be in the LGBTQIA movement, I'll simply say this: hey, I'm not here to actually talk about that so much as, is it your lead identifier? Do you think God dreamed that sexuality would be our lead identifier? Do you think God dreamed that where you work or how many letters are behind your names are your lead identifiers? Or how hot your spouse is, or how accomplished they are, or how good your children are? Are these your lead identifiers? Because if they are, I think Christ would challenge you and say, might I show you other ways to identify yourself? I mean, that's what Christ did all over the place, right? He was walking around and challenging what you use to identify yourself, whether you were a Pharisee or a woman caught in something, right? Or a woman who was angry at the religious establishment at the well, right? And therefore acting up relationally. He'll just sit and politely step in and go, might we talk about the things you use to identify yourself? So that's one of the first things is, let's not make LGBTQ bigger than we need to. It's simply, hey, let's start with first place. How much does that identify who you are? And if it's more than it should, look at it. Just like me, if consumerism over defines me, right? If my whiteness over defines me, I hope someone looks at me and goes, what's your identifier there? So
Mhm.
that's I think the prophetic challenge the church has right now is ask people where they get their primary point of identification. And then I do think that there's like what I would call a ministry calling or a pastoral calling, but I'll just pause there. What do you think of that prophetic challenge that we know our identifiers?
Yeah, I mean, goodness, you're articulating, I think, again, I'm only going to speak for me as a pastor. You're articulating what I have been feeling because
Mm,
in a lot of ways, I feel, at least in the United States, we've lost that prophetic calling in a lot of ways. But the way you're articulating it is helping me understand why. It's because we are identifying ourselves by secondary things, making
yeah,
them primary, and then looking at everybody else, whether they're within the church or outside of the church, and saying, if you don't identify by these things, secondary things that I've made primary, you don't follow Jesus,
that's right.
or you can't follow Jesus.
That's right. And then I was stuck as a dad because moving on to the pastoral, if the prophetic is, hey, be careful your emphasis on the thing that you're identifying with, particularly if you've been oppressed. Because remember, oppression by another or a dominant party only drives you deeper into your identity, which, by the way, is both good and bad. At one level, you need to be driven into it to remind you that you're still valuable for what you are, minus what that dominant voice is saying. But remember, to be driven there by dominant oppression also can cause you to over identify with your identity and therefore lose sight of a wholeness or a fullness that you could be. So be careful, even in that dance. But I'll say this, the other thing I think we have as the church that we can offer is we need to spend the time the hard time it takes to think, well, if I'm going to challenge my daughter to, let's just say, rethink whether or not she's LGBTQIA, I have to be able to substitute other visions of the future for her.
That's so.
Not just say, don't do that because the Bible says you shouldn't, or don't do that because there's such abusive realities and relational dynamics within that movement. By the way, I'm not even suggesting that. I'm just saying these are ways that we leverage in the Christian church
Right.
behavior. Instead, I always say this: you cannot shame something out of someone. You present them with the alternative other, meaning this: when God came to Cain, the first recorded dialogue around sin in the Bible in Genesis 3, Cain's about to kill his brother Abel, and God comes to him and says, "Why has your countenance fallen?" Isn't that interesting? God's first thing is to say, "Hey, something's off a little bit in you. Can't you recognize it in yourself?" And then the second thing the Lord says to him is, hey, do you know that sin is crouching at your door?
Right.
And if you let it in, it will master you, but you've been built to master it. It's such a hopeful way. It's not like, don't do that or you're going to get in trouble. It's much more like, hey, first of all, you know something's off because you were built to flourish and feel right. Secondly, might I remind you, you were built to be a master over things, and you're about to give away your mastery to something else, sin crouching at your door. It's such a hopeful frame to put on things. So I oftentimes say this, we as the church are good at saying something's not right, but rarely can we suggest another. So notice what I didn't suggest to my daughter is do well at school, right? Or, really get good at makeup, be beautiful to get the right guy. Those would have been terrible things to substitute for sexual identity at 15. Instead, I simply substituted a sense of mission. Hey, could we talk about what change you want to be in the world? And then, you know what would it mean to start the early stages to being that kind of change in the world? She happened to choose something as radical as art therapy. She felt art could release healing processes in children that had been traumatized, right? She identified that at 15. And goodness, what a wonderful exploration that's been. And that kind of took over the loud voices of sexual identity. Now, again, friends, notice I'm not decrying the fact that if my daughter one day wrestles through LGBTQ, truthfully, I'm not freaked out if that comes because I kind of trust the Spirit's ability to speak to her about identity. I'm suggesting we as the church have a responsibility to be prophetic in the sense that we say, what's your lead identifier? Political, socioeconomic, sexual? Jesus will confront those things and it wants to be the lead identifier. And then secondly, pastorally, are we good at substituting other things, right? Have we actually worked on what the average Gen Y needs or Gen Z needs to feel identity at the moment? Because you're going to lose on any battle where you're confronting something. You actually have to substitute something else in, I find.
Goodness, Jim, this is profound. Thank you.
I don't know, man. It's just you and I on on a morning kicking it around. It's a good life.
Well, hey, so there's so many things swirling around in my head. Could you frame it this way? Because I love the way you're talking about it's not enough to simply prophetically critique. And it's not just us as God's people critiquing others. It's actually allowing God's Spirit to critique us of our own identifiers.
That's right.
Because like you said, this is what Jesus does all throughout his ministry. And yet it's his love that's motivating that for us. So it has me wondering, could you also frame it in the question of what is good news? So what is good news for our culture at large? What is good news for God's people? What is good news for the millennial generation? What is good news for Gen Z? Is that another way of maybe framing this concept of how are we identifying ourselves?
Absolutely. I think one of the good news of the gospel is like when the angel walks up to Gideon, who's hiding in a hole, and says, "Mighty man of valor." The good news about the gospel is God is protecting your identity even when you're squandering it away by substituting sub-identities in, right? Whether that's your education, whether that's being married to the right person, whether that's identity you're getting through an abusive relationship, whether or not that's your socioeconomic, whether or not it's your sexuality. We have built holes of self-identity for ourselves, and we've begun to think that's who we are. The angel walks up to Gideon and actually uses his real name for him and says, "Mighty man of valor." Strange thing to say to a man who's hiding in the hole, right? Finding out just enough wheat for himself.
Right.
So the first thing the gospel want to say to us is all of us are more than the holes we find ourselves in, whatever that hole is, right? Whatever that hole is. And again, I'm not sitting here trying to decry any one hole more than the other. I think that's another thing the church has to think. Whether or not God's opinion on LGBTQ is probably not much different than his opinion on consumerism, quite honestly. So all that to say, or radical consumerism, right? I mean, the Lord's going to come and say, what are your identifiers? Because I have a different story for you. You were meant to be a mighty man of valor, not someone who hides in the hole. And I think that's the gorgeousness of what goes on with the gospel, that it will confront you in a way that moves you deeper into who you were meant to be. And so it's a reason I'm huge into the gospel. It is, even the woman at the well, right? Jesus is meeting her against all social conventions, and he's doing that conversation with her, right? And then she starts to get comfortable enough that she opens up with one of her identifiers, like, well, I'm actually a Samaritan. You Jews tell us we need to go worship in Jerusalem. And I love Jesus. He goes, oh, no, the Jews are right that you need to go to Jerusalem. But I'm telling you, a day is coming when you can worship me in spirit and truth, right? Where I'm breaking these frames open because my vision for this world's larger than just a place of worship, right? Mm-hmm. And that is Jesus. He will come and both hug us, kick us, and give us a whole new way to understand the world. And that's what I would wish I could say to so many Gen Zers that are wrestling over sexuality now, whatever it is. I don't care if it's abusive heterosexual sexuality, right? Or some, I don't care what your sexuality is this the vision right now that God is wanting to speak over your generation, much less those of us who are in older generations that have substituted other things. I know this, when I was growing up, economic advancement was presented to me as the great vision for my life, the great identifier. And it took a while for Jesus to go, so really, economic advancement, is that which you felt that I called you to in this world? And I'm excited for what the gospel has to say to us, how it both confronts us, hugs us, and then creates a new vision of life for us. It's good stuff.
I love that. I love that image. So as we land the plane on this conversation, and thank you again. I mean, it's been profound. There's so much to chew on from this. I'm wondering, let me use a quote that I actually just saw this quote this week. It said, and I'm paraphrasing, it said something along the lines of, rather than trying to go out and find yourself, create yourself. Okay. Now this was not from scripture. This was just a quote that I had read while I was out and about on my day. And I immediately thought through a biblical framework, my identity is actually made in the image of God. My identity is primarily received, mm-hmm. rather than me going and finding myself, rather than me going and having to create myself, to use this particular quote. So as you're casting this vision for us, I think it's so profound. What do we identify ourselves as? What does Jesus have for us? What might Jesus have for us, Jim?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the beauty of this story is that that's kind of individual, because even the name that God speaks over Gideon's different than the name he speaks over David and the one he speaks over Moses, right? Yeah. Moses is a friend of God. Gideon's a mighty man of valor. David is a man after my own heart. Mary's called the favored one, a desired one, right? I just remind us all that we're even told in Revelations 3 that one day when we're in heaven, we'll be handed a white stone that has our true name on it. Isn't that a neat thought? That God's thoughts towards you outnumber the grains of sand on the seashore to the level of which he sees you for who you are and not for what you become. And that he actually protects an identity for you, even when you're in the midst of you're trying to find sub-identities to feel good about yourself. So I oftentimes say this, there is a stone in heaven that has your name on it. And I have asked the Lord, may I live a life that I don't have to wait to then and go, oh my goodness, that was it? Right? And so I remind you, this is the amazing thing about the Christian revelation added to the Jewish revelation, right? Or let's just say icing on top of the beauty of the cake is that Jesus came to say, no, you have a daddy, father in heaven who has individual dreams of you. Because I'm going to tell you the things I told my daughter Eve when she was 15 about how to not substitute sexuality in as her lead identifier was different than when I told my son at 15. When he was groping for male identity to help him make sense of the world, I had to use a different thing that I spoke over his life to make sure that he wasn't seeking in the wrong directions for the band of brothers worldview or something like, or national identity to substitute in or something like that, or hunting culture or something, all the things that were offered to him in South Central PA. I had to say, son, who were you? So there's what I want to remind us what a wonderful God. And Joe, what you just said, our God is holding our identities for us. So this isn't even a hard pressure that you got to go out and find it. I mean, Jesus the angel walks up to Gideon and says, no, mighty man of valor. Isn't like, well, you're not that. Let's go find what you are. It's not even that. Like, no, I'm protecting something about you. Man, I wish we were communities of faith that could lead people better into God's name over their life. And then some of these sub-identity stuffs, whether they're positive or negative, they're thin compared to the thick version of life that God has for us, right? I'm just so tired of thin versions of life, whether it's sexuality, political, economic, workplace. These are thin versions of who we're meant to be. So,
my, oh my. Jim, this is gold. Thank you.
Hey, man, my pleasure, pal. Anytime you want to chat. I got no social life, Joe. You're it.
So, hey, I'll end with one final question for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so on a very practical level, so you just painted this beautiful picture of the individual vision that God has for each of us.
Yeah.
What steps can we take starting tonight? What steps can we take to begin to live into that and out of that?
Yeah, first thing I would do is go to 3 of your friends and say, could you each share 3 words that you think of when you think of me? Don't let them share 5. Don't let them explain. Let's say, no. Just 3 words when you think of me, when you see into who I am, because you've been my friend for a while. Pick 3 friends, ask for 3 words, see if there's any common thread in that. Because if they really are friends, they'll speak through to who you are. So even while you're still learning how to hear the voice of God or identify with God's dream over your life, the Holy Spirit has put things in your life to remind you who you are, not what you become. So find 3 friends, ask them each for 3 words. And then, for fun, share with those 3 friends the 9 words. Once you have all 9 words, sit down with each of those 3 friends again and go, what do you see in this for me? Let a community speak into your identity when you're rebuilding, right? Because so many of these voices that are calling to us, whether it's sexual, political, we're all getting segmented, right? Mm-hmm. And then you get super insulated into tribes around a subculture, right? And that's just the best thing to do is find 3 good truth-talking friends and find 9 things about yourself and then say, help me pick 1 or 2 of these that I can live into this year. And then watch if God and the Holy Spirit doesn't race in there and help to reinforce, like, darn tootin', you're meant to be a bridge that whenever you show up, people who are in disagreement seem to calm down a little bit. So what's it mean to have a calling of a peacemaker, right? Like that's identity, right? That's identity. And then we can add all these other thinner things on top of that thick core. So yeah, find 3 friends, make them say 3 words about you.
Wonderful.
Are you going to be calling me later, Joe?
Yeah.
Jim, I need 3 words.
I need them now.
I'd have them for you, Joe.
Oh man! All right, I'm going to be calling you now. I'm going to hold you to it. And by the way, we've been doing Embracing the Moment for a year now, and this is the first time I've heard "darn tootin'" used on Embracing the Moment.
It's a good word, man. We're trying to bring it back. Bring it back.
Darn tootin' into this complex, deep conversation. I love it.
You can take a boy out of York County. You can't take York County out of the boy.
Jim, thanks so much for your time. This was very rich conversation. Thank you for challenging us. Thank you for giving us a lot to think about, a lot to ponder over. And I love the practical application at the end. And for those of you tuning in, I encourage you, take Jim's advice, take Jim's challenge. And as you are learning who God has made you to be, may you experience that blessing. May you begin to step into and live out of who God has made you uniquely to be.
That's right. Hear, hear.
So Jim, thanks, man.
Anytime, pal. Take care.
Wonderful. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll pick up next week back in our regular series where we're looking at COVID 1 year later. Looking forward to our next conversation, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.